Hi, welcome to class. I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State. The class is Ethics and Values, and we're continuing on with our discussion on war and nuclear war. Our guest for this class period is Dr. Scott Abbott. Thanks for joining us today, Scott.
Welcome.
And our students who are here are Lloyd and Aaron, and over here we have Rhonda and John. Thanks to all of you for being here with us. Well, Scott, you really enjoy interdisciplinary study and interdisciplinary work, and that's what we've been doing in the class. We've been looking at interdisciplinary aspects of first business ethics and now war and nuclear war, and our last one will be interdisciplinary aspects of sexual morality. Today, you're going to be helping us with the historical aspects, but before we do that, would you give us some background on yourself, tell us about yourself, and especially why you like interdisciplinarity?
I came to Utah Valley State College 7 years ago to take the job of Director of Integrated Studies, and you were the one who invited me here, and it's been a good place to work. Integrated Studies, interdisciplinary studies, is a chance for to look at a big problem from a lot of different aspects, and that's this not question of dropping the bomb on Japan needs looking at from a lot of different aspects. So that's my background, and that's the kind of work I do.
Thank you. Your PhD's from Princeton, and you spent a good 7 or 8 years at Vanderbilt, and from there some time at BYU before we snitched you away. So, and he's a very popular teacher, very well liked. So, and extremely rigorous. And so, looking forward to having a good discussion with you. When you think about war and peace and the big problems that it brings, what comes to mind for you? What are solutions, especially when we're surrounded by wars?
I just read Chris Hedges' book, War as a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and he makes the point that sometimes wars are inevitable, and he's not an absolute pacifist. But his point is that any time there's a war, things will happen that shouldn't happen, that you don't want to happen, that are unethical, that are immoral. So you should be very, very careful about entering into any war. And maybe that's the context that seems most important to me about any discussion about war.
Thank you, and I think it really fits in today because our two readings for today, the first one is the children of Hiroshima, and as you look at these, you see how the children are affected by war, just violently affected. And in the second one, we're looking at the decision to bomb Japan, and in some respects making it look quite sterile, but we see a lot of things happened in war that shouldn't have. Yeah. Well, during this time then of the dropping of the bomb, the development of the bomb, and then the Cold War years after, you and I were subjected to something called duck and cover. And I have a little graphic that I'd like to show all of us that takes us back to historical times when some of these events were taking place.
Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people, please. Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are around us all the time. The bomb might explode when there are no grown-ups near. Paul and Patty know this, and they're always ready to take care of themselves. Here they are on their way to school on a beautiful spring day. But no matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know what to do. Paul covered the back of his head so that he wouldn't be burned, and Patty covered herself with the coat she was carrying. They knew how to duck and cover.
Thank you. Rhonda, you were mentioning that you went through these kinds of activities. What do you think about this being an unintended consequence of war, an unintended consequence of strategic defense or mutually assured destruction?
Well, the anxiety that is produced I was a child. Mm-hmm. You never know what's going to happen. You know, you're always in fear. You You're not sure who to trust. You hope that nothing will happen, and you're not sure what will happen or what it all means. And so there's questions and anxiety. And
thank you. And Scott, we know that they or them could drop these weapons of mass destruction on us at any time, and at the moment we're just thinking about, you know, not getting burned, but of course we know now that there are worse effects than that. But tell us a little bit then about children and anxiety and what the children in the U.S. might have been going through before we look at the children in Japan.
What struck me watching that little clip was how useless any of that is. So when we were in our school class and they said duck and cover and we jumped under our little wooden desks, that would have made absolutely no difference if there'd been an atomic bomb dropped anywhere near. So it seems to me like all of those attempts are attempts to make you feel like you have some control in a place where you have absolutely no control. So and then as Rhonda said, it's psychologically difficult for children and adults to live in a situation where there might be an absolute loss of any control.
Well, do you want to tell us a little bit about the author of this reading, John, and a little bit about the reading, and then I'm going to ask Lloyd to tell us a little bit about his thoughts being of Japanese ancestry.
Okay. Arata Osada, I have that pronounced right. He was president of Hiroshima University of Humanities and Science, and I guess he was also a physician. And he collected these pieces of children of Hiroshima in order to, as a way to promote peace, world peace. And if we could tell about the horrible experiences on the ground that civilians experienced with the bombing of Hiroshima, then maybe we could promote peace in that way. And yeah.
And he's become very well known for these because they're so potent and powerful coming from children. So Lloyd, what were your thoughts on this as you were reading it?
As I was reading this, and I think we've been focusing a lot on nuclear weapons, and which is good, but in a lot of sense we've been ignoring, and in a lot of ways history has largely ignored atrocities and other instances where it's just like Hiroshima, civilians were attacked, and a lot of these happened in Japan with the fire bombings. And I had my mom wasn't born at the time, but my mom's family, so my grandma and grandpa and some of my aunts were alive at the time when Tokyo was firebombed, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed as well. And at that instance, my aunt was riding on the back of my grandma's, being carried on her back, and as they were running out, trying to find protection from the fires, my aunt's hair caught fire, and I mean, so they were that close to all this. And so I mean, it was that close where, you know, just a matter of, you know, just that I was this close from me not being here because of that. So.
Thank you very much. And as we look at these, we can see the strong desire, especially of the Japanese people, to say, we want peace. We don't ever want to have a horror like this happen again. And I think we probably see many U.S. citizens feeling the same way. Other thoughts from students on this? Okay. I have one more clip that I'd like to show you on the destructive nature of an atomic bomb, and this would be similar to the ones that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So let's go ahead and show this airburst.
15.
Cameras are ready aboard ship and in the sky.
2, 1, fire.
Plutonium, half the weight of a dime, caused this. This is the force that can destroy our world unless we find the road to peace.
Okay, thank you. So he's saying this is a force that can destroy our world unless we find the force to peace, the road to peace, and this blatant force. Well, let's go ahead and see then a little bit about those who suffered from this force in our first reading, and in our second one, did it really need to be used? So, Aaron, could I have you read our first story for us? And this is from a 4th grade boy who was 4 years old at the time of the bombing. And I'm going to just have you read directly out of your book since the graphics would be so long on this. But would you read the first 2 paragraphs and then the last 2 paragraphs?
Okay. I hadn't started school yet. On August 6th, I was playing in front of a public bathhouse in our neighborhood. Sai-chan asked me to go to the fields and bring her some flowers, so I was on my way there. Then it suddenly got very bright. I was very surprised, so I thought I would go into the house, but suddenly it seemed like dozens of needles were stuck in my eyes, and I didn't know who I was or where I was going. I struggled toward the house and ran into the front door. When I opened my eyes, it was dim and gloomy. Then I saw my grandma running away as fast as she could with Kaika-chan, my younger brother, on her back. I went with her. We went to the air raid shelter. One of my big sisters was already inside, so the 4 of us all huddled together. Then another big sister came running in and joined us. She was working at the Mitsuboshi bakery making cakes. My mother had already got sick and died. There are only 4 paragraphs
And
here.
continue on, yeah.
My father had gone to work as a volunteer, and he came back looking for us. My oldest sister heard him calling, and she took my father's hand and led him to our air raid shelter. My father was burned everywhere above his waist. Both of my older sisters and the other people were scared when they saw the burns. A stranger put some oil on my father's burns. I said thank you to him in my heart. After that, we went to a hill in Fuchu. We put up a mosquito net in the ruins of a temple and slept inside. We lived there a long time.
Okay, thanks. And then he says that about 60 days later, that his father called to his grandmother and said, will you make me a potato? And she said, okay. And when she called to say the potato was ready, his father was dead. And so we can see, he says goodbye to my father and my mother, but we can see the tough living conditions here, and we also see that the bombing was unexpected, that the air raid warnings had gone off, and it appeared that there was not going to be a strike, so many people had gone back outside again. Thoughts on this particular reading? Anything that you'd like to mention, Scott?
I'm remembering the New York Times reporter who worked for the War Department also. So there was a big conflict of interest. His name is William Lawrence. And he was on a plane that witnessed the bombing of Nagasaki, the second bomb, and he described it as powerful and beautiful and supernatural. And his reporting in the New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize, but none of the reporting paid any attention to what this child has just described with radiation and burns and all of that. The U.S. government claimed that the blast killed all the people, and they actively kept reporters from going to Hiroshima. It was an Australian reporter who went there first against orders and reported about the burns and the radiation. So the government hired a New York Times reporter to write about the beauty and power of and goodness of this, and this child's little account here shows just the opposite.
You know, as we were putting together some of these nuclear bomb clips for this class, Channing Lowe and I were commenting on the very same thing, that the wording describing the bombs were all beautiful, magnificent, you know, powerful, glorious, and that it's not talking about the destructive nature and how inherently deadly everything about this explosion is. So thank you very much for that insight. Other thoughts on this, or should we move on to another story? Well, Lloyd, let's have you pick up on the next story for us, and let's go to the 5th grade boy who's 5 years old at the time, and what happens with him. He's playing outdoors, the air raid warning goes off, he goes inside, then goes back outside because he doesn't think anything's going to happen, and the house falls on him. And so he's having a very tough go of it. And if you'd read on the second column, the very last paragraph for us.
Yeah, this is Hiroaki Ichikawa. He says, on the day after the bomb, we started toward the country, and when we came to Hijiyama Bridge, We saw naked people with their burned skin hanging from them like rags. We saw others covered with blood, being carried to safer places in trucks. In the tobacco factory, about 1.5 miles from the bomb center, were many people crying from the pain of their burns. Both mother and father often tell us that it was like hell.
And it takes them about 5 years then to return to their home of Hiroshima, and said, that things had completely changed once they got back there. But it is shocking, like you say. We didn't know that there were people with these severe burns that are just walking around waiting to die.
I was struck reading some of these accounts, how the children kept saying, and then we grew a garden. Everybody said that no garden could grow for such a long time, and then we grew a garden. And I was thinking, well, those then would be radiated potatoes or tomatoes or whatever they were growing, and then that goes through a whole generation as well.
Very good. So many mutagenic and teratogenic effects of the radiation poisoning and the damage done here. Rhonda.
I was just thinking how, what Scott was saying, that so much was kept from the newspapers and information given when we had just come off of seeing such horrific torture and pain in Germany, at some of the death camps, and how we could see that and send such, our soldiers had seen that and come back, and told people, and everybody was aghast. And yet this happens, and no one wants to even see that, the things that had happened there. I find that uncanny.
It is, yeah. Lloyd.
This is a comment I was going to want to hold off. Let's say it now. I think one of these things that's really hard to understand and to grasp is that these discussions we've been talking about how civilians are the accidental casualties of nuclear war and whatnot, but these weren't accidental casualties. The government wanted these casualties to happen. They didn't want Americans to know, but they wanted the Japanese government to know about these casualties. They wanted civilians to die because, and that's one of the big myths that we have is, every war we go into, we say, well, we're not targeting civilians. But in reality, we are targeting civilians. We just pretend we're not because that sounds bad. But in war, we want civilians to die because that's what causes the psychological damage, as they even discuss in their later texts, where, they wanted people to suffer, they wanted people to die because that's what's going to scare Japan or other people to withdraw from the war.
Thank you. In fact, in the piece by Marion Yass that you were talking about, they do talk about the destruction of major population centers, and that these are just the first two. So are you going to surrender? John.
I just wanted to kind of add to what Lloyd's saying. One of my favorite comments that I've ever heard about World War II came from Robert McNamara, who became Secretary of Defense under JFK and was a military strategist at the time during World War II. And he actually said if the United States had lost World War II, then he and many other strategists would have been convicted of war crimes. It just says, even he knew the catastrophic effects of dropping the bomb. They knew, and they knew that it was brutal, and it was something almost worthy of war crimes.
Well, I saw that too. Wasn't that Curtis LeMay who said that, who was the commander of all of those forces that were bombing Japan? And was he the one who said, I would be convicted of war crimes if we hadn't won
it may
the war?
have been, but I think McNamara reiterates the point in a documentary called Fog of War.
I saw that. It's really good.
It is.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts or comments on this one then? Very good. Well, let's go ahead and read then from a 9th grade boy who was in the 3rd grade at the time. And let's go ahead and skip down just a little bit. We're on page 293. And it starts out, me and my friends were talking about the war. Then we heard an air raid warning. I ran from my home and was playing there for a while. I was used to all this. Then the all clear was given and I went to school again. Can you see where I am on that? Rhonda, would you pick up there?
Our teacher had not come yet. So we were just talking. About then, we heard the sound of an airplane, and we could see it, very small, in the southeastern sky. It got bigger and bigger, and soon was over our heads. I was looking at it all the time. I didn't know whether it was an American plane or ours. All of a sudden, something white like a parachute fell out of the plane. 5 or 6 seconds later, everything turned yellow. It was like I'd looked right at the sun. Then there was a big sound, a second or two later, and everything went dark. Stones and tiles fell on my head, and I was knocked out for a bit. Then I woke up because heavy pieces of wood fell on me and hurt my back. I crawled out into the open. There I saw lots of people lying on the ground. Most of them were burned, and their faces had gone black. I felt better when I got out on the road, and then suddenly felt my right arm hurting. The skin from the elbow to the fingers had peeled off. I began to walk toward where I thought my home was. "Sumi-chan," called a voice. I turned around and saw my sister. Her dress was torn to rags and her face completely different. The two of us went home, but our house had crumbled down and no one was there. We looked around nearby. When we got back, we found Father, who was trying to get something out from under the fallen roof. He gave up and walked up to us. "Where is Mother?" I said. "She is dead," he repeated weakly. When I heard that, I felt as if I had been hit on the head. I couldn't think. After a while, Father said, "What's the matter with your head?" I felt the back of my head. It felt rough and was soaked with blood. A nail 5 inches long had struck into Mother's head, and she died instantly.
Okay, thank you. And so we can see that in some of this, it's a train of thought, and in other areas he's saying, you know, the back of my head had blood on it, but my mother's head had had a nail 5 inches deep in it. So, and you see that this is happening to one third-grade boy, and probably happening to numerous other children too at the very same time. And he talks about how they were very thirsty, and on page 393, just a little further down, "I felt very thirsty and went to the river to drink some water. Many blackened dead bodies were floating down the stream. I had to keep pushing them away while I drank. Along the edge of the water were a lot of dead people. Some were still alive. A child was crying, 'Mother, mother.' Already when I saw dead bodies, I didn't think much about it." Lloyd, tell us a little bit about the coping mechanisms going on here and kind of the horror of giving account on all of this.
Well, you can just see with this child when he needs the water and stuff, he sees the dead bodies, and it's just, you know, like any person, you get to the point where you just have to say, okay, I just don't care about this anymore. Yeah, these are dead bodies, and that's just what they are. They're just chunks of whatever, you know. They're not people anymore. You can see that he had to disassociate himself with these were suffering people and whatnot, and just couldn't think about that anymore.
Okay, and so hard for us to imagine that a third grader is thinking this way and thinking this way out of means of survival then. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the horrors of seeing dead bodies floating down the river and trying to get a drink in between them, Scott?
Well, like you, that was a shocking passage.
Yeah.
I guess what struck me is we had 5 or 6 or 7 stories here of children, and do people think that there were maybe 120,000 people killed in the Hiroshima blast, and 70 to 80,000 people killed in Nagasaki, and 100,000 people killed in the firebombing that Lloyd was talking about before? So I guess the power of these stories are they're very individual stories, and then the shocking part to me comes when you start multiplying those by 100,000.
And you look at all the families of the dead who are affected, because as you look at these, every child seems to be crying out for their mother. That in almost every one of these, their mother or their father is killed. They have sisters who are killed, and so that even multiplies the horror, the pain more than they're the living going through this suffering. So, any other comments on this, Erin?
Oh, I like the last paragraph best. I know it's a bit...
Oh, go ahead, and we've got it right here.
Oh,
I hate 294.
Yeah. I hate war now from the bottom of my heart. It is entirely due to the war that my kind mother and sisters were killed. I don't hate anybody because Mother is dead, but I hate war. I don't want hateful war to happen again. War is everyone's enemy. Mother's soul in heaven will be happy if we stop wars and peace comes to the world.
Okay, thank you. So he's hoping for peace to come to the world. And Lloyd, I don't know if this is how you've been, but when I've had Japanese students or Japanese American students they've all expressed this need for peace, that they don't want any war. What kind of discussions have you had about this?
You know, it's funny because, you know, so I had on my mom's side of the family, who's from Japan, you know, she had family members, uncles and aunts and whatnot. One of my grandmas had an earlier fiance at a certain time that went to the war, and so there was and on that side, but then on my dad's side as well, we had people fighting on the American side. So I mean, there's that going on, and it shows that war affects everyone. I mean, you could go through, and it's not just this war. I mean, you could go to Iraq, Israel, Lebanon. I mean, any country where war's going on, and you could collect these stories from children. I mean, almost identical stories of children who just, you know, who have to live through this suffering and have to live through this pain and everything. So so I like how this young child says, you know, I hate war. It wasn't just something that happened to him. It's something that happens to everyone.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. In the next story, it talks about the horrors of looking for those who are missing. And so we have different folks in a family. Some are gone to work, some have remained at home, others are in different schools. And in here, this 11th grade boy, 5th grade at the time, talks about the parents wanting to get the family reunited together, and it doesn't happen. They can't find the sisters. They can't find those who are missing. On page 295, the first column right in the middle, he says, "On the following day, my father and mother both went out to look for my sister but couldn't find her. I went with father during the afternoon and found the streets were quite dangerous, what with tangled and broken streetcar wires. We went along the banks of the river and saw schoolboys and girls of my sister's age lying in groups, already dying in agony. They pleaded for water from anyone who walked by. My father said, 'Your father or mother is surely to come looking for you soon, so take heart and don't give up.'" And so you can just see how painful the search would be for the family members and how important it is that we have these stories. Rhonda, tell us a little bit about the importance of having these stories.
You know, there's been people that haven't believed that this war or that atrocity has ever happened, except for the stories that would testify, you know, to the horrors and accuracy of what they told. These stories are important. If we're to learn how to live peaceably with each other, or what things that we ought not to use, it is the stories that are left for us.
Okay, and even some of the details, because we go back to seeing what some of the students were like from the sister school, and it says they must have come here looking for somewhere cool. What they had been wearing was burned, and they had nothing on. Their skin was slimy from burns and already infested with maggots. Was my sister in the same state? And basically, all they found of her then was her underwear to know that she was dead. And so, a very tough identification for this particular family, and this young man saying, "I'll never have her greeting me again when I come in the door." Rhonda?
Yeah, I think the other thing to remember is that there were hundreds of thousands of people that were basically incinerated to begin with, but that there were thousands of people that died the next day, the next week, the next month, the next year, that were all related to the same thing.
Thank you. And also knowing then that these deformities, these mutagenic deformities now will go on to other generations, whether this is something that happened with the bomb or the vegetables or something else, and something that is a continual scientific study looking at these.
I read an account of the firebombing of Tokyo that Lloyd was talking about. That he had a relative in, and I was interested in it because my father was a navigator on a B-29 that flew out of Tinian, just like the planes that dropped the atomic bomb. So he had volunteered when he graduated from high school. He got flight training, and now he's a young man firebombing Tokyo. And I'd never even heard about that firebombing. I'd heard about the atomic bombs. But I wanted to talk, my father is dead, but I wanted to ask my mother if she had memories of talking with him about that, what it felt like. And in the article, it had described the horrors of it. So you set up a circle of incendiary bombs, and they burn together into the center, and then there are enormously high temperatures, and everything in that whole circle dies. So that's how you get 100,000 people dying in Tokyo in one night. And then the bombers, the article described as just being bounced around on this intense heat. I mean, if they got anywhere close there, it was just crazy flying. So I was asking my mother about that and hinting that maybe that was a bad decision of the U.S. government to commit what some people see as an atrocity in that war. And she said, they bombed us first. And it was very clear in her mind that, all right, these stories that we've been reading about people being hurt and burned and killed and drinking water with dead bodies around, okay, that all happened, but they bombed us first. And in fact, she still used the word Jap. The Japs bombed us first. And so there was a whole structure in her mind that made all other thinking after that unnecessary. That happened, therefore, this is all called for, and your little stories, I guess I don't care for them. That was her response.
And didn't care to talk about your father's story either.
Well, my father never talked. If you're involved in something like that, the normal course of events would be, it was so horrible to have done, to have been part of, that you don't go home and brag about it. You did it because you thought it was necessary, and you may still think it was necessary, but he didn't talk about it.
Okay, thank you. John?
I hear that, and I also think it would be even more horrifying for someone that experienced that to then question whether or not it was a moral thing to do. I think after the fact, I mean, if they were to read something like this or read something about the firebombing of Tokyo that they were involved in, and to think that they were involved in, and then maybe even question whether or not it was moral, I think that would be a truly horrifying human experience.
Yeah.
I think the justification comes, though, is that so many people will say, you know, if we didn't do it to them, they would come and do it to us. And so I think a lot of people would say, read these stories and put Americans in there, you know, as a justification, you know, as a...
Well, and that's how we can kind of see the duck and cover. It didn't happen to those little children.
Right.
But it did happen to these other children who had been duck and covering for the fire bombings, but it wasn't going to help much with when the actual devastating atomic bomb hit. Well, I really like your segue, and I think it pulls us into our next reading. That's by Marian Yass on the decision to bomb Japan. And in an ethics class, we're always looking at rational justification. We're always looking at looking things through and seeing how we made our decisions. And I think that history and this historical excerpt gives us a chance then to reflect on history. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you see the value of this piece?
It was fascinating reading some things I didn't know about Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin, trying to think through the nuclear scientists who developed the bomb, trying to think it through. It's an enormously problematic decision, and a lot of people had a lot of second guesses. And anyway, the article led us through reasons in a pretty interesting way.
Absolutely did. And you know, as I was reading it, I just had to look up things about Truman and about Secretary of War Henry Stimson to see, you know, what was really going on here. And so I think these are all important things for you as students to do, that as you're reading a piece like this, do some research and do some critical analysis on it, some good reflection. In looking at Stimson, you find that he is a very powerful person. And so here you have Truman, who's only been president, he's been the vice president for 82 days when Roosevelt dies, and he hasn't had any prepping, any knowledge about what's going on in the Pacific Rim. And so here he's thrown into this devastating war circumstance, and he's educated by Stimson, who's Secretary of War, who has a definite perspective that we've been building this bomb and we need to use it. So I think a question always comes up, would Roosevelt have ever used the bomb? or maybe would we have stayed with some other conventional means? Any thoughts on that?
We'll never know. You
We'll
can't
never know, will
second guess
we?
that. But that must have been a shocking moment for Truman to sit in a room with Stimson and have him say, "Oh, by the way, we've got this bomb." What do you start thinking at that moment?
This bomb, and it has the capacity, it has the destructive capacity that like we've never seen before. Yeah.
It was Truman's, I don't know this, it was Truman's idea was to use it to, that would end the war and that there would be no other wars because of this mass destruction ability?
Well, who knows that either? Who knows that either? But I think that they felt like that there were so many American casualties in this war, that something big needed to happen. And so we start looking at the logical syllogism, and the real big thing was this real big weapon, which does give the U.S. incredible military superiority then for generations to come. Any thoughts on this or things you'd like to add? Well, let's go ahead and pull up a couple of graphics then that pull us into this historical piece. And Erin, would you read the first couple for us?
Sure. Scientists knew fear. In 1945, when we ceased worrying about what the Germans might do to us, we began to worry about what the government of the United States might do to other countries.
And the next one?
The first scientist to be worried was the Dane Niels Bohr. He saw that the atomic bomb would create new world problems. Bohr knew that tension between Russia and her Western allies would probably develop after the war, the more so if Russia was left to find out about the bomb for herself. The secret must be shared. Bohr talked to Roosevelt's advisors and wrote to Sir John Anderson in London. Anderson, much impressed, contacted Winston Churchill. Churchill merely scribbled, "I do not agree," on Anderson's note.
Okay, where are we going with this, Lloyd?
Well, you can see, at least the way I see things going is you have this question of should Russia know about the bomb? And I think, and it becomes a bigger part of the discussion is what effect will the atomic bomb have on Russia, which in my view, I think really was one of the big reasons why they decided to drop the bomb was to show American strength to Russia.
Okay, interesting insight on that. How about you, Erin?
I think it's interesting that that what we're talking about is a scientist, a world-renowned physicist, telling these world leaders that this is something you need to reconsider, and yet they're going to just ignore him for the most part.
Okay, so you've got a Dane. He's going to say, listen, Germany's out of the war. Their part of the war is over, and now it's just America and Japan in here. And he's going to say there's a terrible consequence of using this weapon, but folks don't want to hear. In some respects, I almost feel like the way this was written, and this is written by an Englishman, that Churchill wanted to watch the United States do this and just kind of sit back and not have to take any responsibility on it. What are your thoughts on this, Scott?
I thought the same thing. It's convenient for Churchill that he can say, I do not agree, but then he doesn't have to agree and he doesn't have to make the decision. And so,
might some of his feelings, though, come from the fact that England had been receiving its own bombs, and at some point, they didn't get away scot-free, and so to allow the Americans to do it, like you were saying, would keep him out of the mix of having to be responsible.
it's an interesting perspective that the English had that the United States didn't have, because the Germans had been bombing London, and they knew what it felt like to have bombs indiscriminately dropped on civilian populaces. And then their Air Marshal Harris had decided that they would do area bombing, and so the British Royal Air Force was bombing Hamburg, and they decided to firebomb Dresden. After the firebombing had worked in Hamburg, and 35,000, maybe 100,000 people died in Dresden of firebombs.
Exactly.
So they'd tried it all out, the British had, and it's no really big jump, I don't think, from firebombing a populace and an atomic bomb. The scientists, I think, knew, and that's what we just read, they knew that maybe there were implications beyond just the power of a single bomb. But I don't think Churchill and the others who were making decisions, finally Truman, realized that this was much more than just the biggest weapon that had come along. And if you have a big weapon and you're fighting a fierce war, you'll always use it. And this whole article is about the deliberations and the reasoning, but doesn't it come down finally to the point, if you're in the war and your whole purpose is to end the war and win the war, then you're going to use whatever means are necessary? Is there any war ever been fought where people didn't use every weapon that they could possibly use?
Other than, thankfully, we're not using nuclear weapons in wars now, and hopefully they won't be used in the future.
That's true. We didn't use it in the Korean War.
No, and I suppose that some of the weapons are quite similar, some of the tactical weapons, to nuclear weapons in Iraq and other places, but at least we're not calling them nuclear weapons.
Right.
Yeah. Well, John, let's have you continue reading for us. And so Bohr is not going to stop here. He's going to talk to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt's very ill. But do you want to start with a weapon of unparalleled power?
Yes. A weapon of unparalleled power is being created. Quite apart from the question of how soon the weapon will be ready for use and what role it may play in the present war, the situation raises a number of problems which call for most urgent attention.
And continue on.
Unless, indeed, some agreement about the control of the use of the new active materials can be obtained, any temporary advantage, however great, may be outweighed by a perpetual menace to human security.
And continue on.
Roosevelt and Churchill met at Hyde Park, Washington in September 1944. Neither was moved by Bohr's plea for caution.
Okay, so then according to Marion Yass, they're going to move forward still with this weapon. So Bohr, who is still seen as a renowned scientist, is giving this warning, and it's not going to be heeded. Any thoughts on this, Aaron, as you're looking at two very prominent people in history who are unmoved by Bohr's caution?
Well, I mean, I guess I understand in our previous episodes and discussions that, you know, we've talked about the idea of the difference between the ideological and the practical. And I think that here we have a great historical example of just that. You have Niels Bohr, who's saying we need to think more about what we're using. We need to look. I understand that the studies have been done and you've made this weapon, but that's not enough. That we don't necessarily want to use a weapon, that just because we have it, kind of an idea. But you have Roosevelt and Churchill who go, but this is, we're waging a war here.
Okay.
That's the feeling I get, and maybe that's part my reading into it, but.
Sure, and the next thing they want to do is bring Einstein in and have him sign a petition from all the scientists saying, please do not unleash this destructive force. Lloyd.
I was going to say, I think it's interesting that one of the voices that's completely missing from this paper is that of Eisenhower, who led the Allied troops in World War II, and he knew about the bomb and had strong moral oppositions against it, yet he's not mentioned. His opposition to its use is not mentioned at all in this paper. Okay,
thank you. I think another startling point that we notice in here is that, and we see this with Oppenheimer and others, is that once the scientists were finished putting the bomb together, they were expected not to give any thought as to the consequences of the bomb. They were expected to just walk away from it. And some of the scientists felt that callous going into it, and others were told that by politicians afterwards. But do scientists have a moral responsibility in the making of weapons of mass destruction, Scott?
That's a question that goes around and around and around, isn't it?
Yeah.
I guess I find most interesting here that they did. They had a broader view, and what we were just looking at, Bohr is claiming that any temporary advantage, and there are clear temporary advantages to dropping this bomb. It may end the war, it may save lives. So all of the practical arguments that are given are about the temporary advantage. But then he figures that that may be outweighed by a perpetual menace to human society, and that's what you were just talking about, I think. And I think we have found that that's the case, and so haven't used it again.
Thankfully, yes. Rhonda.
Well, the question that you just posed, I don't remember, it was at this this session of another class, that whether you win the war or you lose the war is when those people who have had a hand in the preparation or the diabolical participation in this or that are prosecuted in war crimes. You know, again, I think of, you know, was it Dr. Mengele? Mengele.
Yeah.
You know, he certainly was found, you know, prosecuted for his part in doing his experiments, in all the methods that he used.
I think that's the most interesting part of this whole question. If you decide as a country to do what needs to be done to win a war, and if that includes firebombing Tokyo, I mean, there are clear conventions against that kind of activity, and countries aren't supposed to hurt civilian populations, and we always do. But the moment you decide to do that, what moral leverage do you have to argue that anybody else shouldn't employ any means to win a war, because you've just decided to employ any and the worst means to win your war? So how can you argue against Croats and Serbs and Bosnians raping populations to win their war? Because they figure, well, I'm going to win that war out of psychological force. And they end up in the International War Crimes Tribunal for war crimes. But if you've committed an act like this, which is against all conventions, and which was done just to win the war, that's your only means. So you've thrown away all moral constraints. How can you argue against anybody else? How can you argue against Hutus killing 800,000 Tutsis in 100 days? They can argue, we had to do that to get the end of winning this war. How do you argue against that if you've committed acts like that?
And you know, the important saying, little trite saying that goes along with this is the winners write the history books. So whoever the winner is will get to tell their account and why this was not a war crime, why it was necessary to win the war.
Right.
And that this certainly was not an atrocity. Well, let's pick up on slide 596, where we have President Truman then. We have Roosevelt dying, we have President Truman taking over as president, and meeting with Secretary of War Stimson. And let's go ahead and have these two slides read by Lloyd, please.
Yeah, Harry S. Truman, the new president, wrote under the date line, April 25th. At noon, I saw Secretary of War Stimson in connection with the urgent letter he had written. He went into considerable detail in describing the nature of and the power of the projected weapon. If expectations were to be realized, he told me, the atomic bomb would be certain to have a decisive influence, and if it worked, the bomb in all probability would shorten the war.
Okay.
And those three words, or those four words, are the only redeeming part, I think, of this, and if it worked. Mm-hmm. Which gives me some sort of a clue that maybe they didn't know exactly what it would do.
At this point, they still don't, because we're about ready to have a baby delivered. So they're talking about it in terms of delivery of a baby. And so here we know then that we have Truman. He's only been vice president for 82 days. Suddenly he's president. Now he's being briefed. And he's in the middle of World War II, and he's being told he has this huge weapon of mass destruction. And we also find that Stimson's account, any of you can look that up as well, and it says that he wrote the decision to use the atomic bomb in Harper's February of 1947. So if any of you would like to look up Henry L. Stimson's account of why he thought it was so necessary to use the bomb, you can. And let's go ahead and read the next couple of slides. Rhonda, would you read these, please?
Stimson advises Truman to set up interim committee to recommend action that may turn the course of civilization. In our hands, we expect soon to have a weapon of wholly unprecedented destructive power. Our great task is to bring this war to a prompt and successful conclusion. We may assume that our new weapon puts in our hands overwhelming power. It is our obligation to use this power with the best wisdom we can command.
And continue on.
Could I break in?
Sure.
In the book, there's that phrase right here, today's prime fact is war, and then our great task is to bring this war to a prompt and successful conclusion. When Stimson decides today's prime fact is war, he's saying, as I tried to say previously, that's the only thing that matters. And so then all the reasoning flows from there.
Thank you. So that thesis is now set.
Yeah.
And once we accept that thesis, then we will be accepting the conclusion that goes with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's exactly how logic's going to work in any of your papers that you're writing. So, yes.
Aren't there historians that question whether or not the bomb was necessary in ending the war in the way that Stimson is talking about it? Aren't there historians that are saying the war that Japan would have surrendered without, and now that's kind of Stimson's justification, is that Japan would not have surrendered unless we dropped the bomb. But aren't there historians that are saying Japan was in the process of surrendering before we dropped the bomb, or they were getting close? I know I've read a lot of Howard Zinn, and he kind of brings this up. The historian Howard Zinn kind of questions whether or not Japan would have actually surrendered before the bomb was dropped.
They were talking with the Russians at that point, trying to figure out something, and the back and forths the negotiation hadn't yet borne any fruit, but it might have. And one of the arguments is that maybe 500,000 U.S. soldiers' lives are saved if you don't have to do a ground war in Japan. And I read a more recent evaluation that suggested maybe that'd be 20 or 30,000 and not 500,000. But still, at the moment you decide the only thing that matters is winning this war, and we will win it, and we don't care about what happens to them. And you've already decided that in all these earlier moments where you're bombing civilian populations or firebombing. So it's not as big a decision for them at that moment as it seems like to us now, I don't think.
And as we move through the chronology of the use of the bomb, we also see that perhaps there wasn't enough warning given to Japan about the bomb. That when they received the message, Roosevelt happened to be in the air, and that perhaps there really was communication that they were trying to get back. But as this moves along, we see then where Arthur Compton says, why don't we demonstrate the bomb? That would be a great idea. And then they decide, no, we don't need to show them what we really have. Let's just decide that we're gonna have this and keep it. And they're talking about this interim committee. This was something that Stimson told Truman that he ought to do. The two of them were on the committee, as well as some other very powerful people. And so we have others who are coming into the mix. Oppenheimer. Do you want to tell us a little bit about who Robert Oppenheimer was, Scott, and where he comes into this?
I don't know lots about Oppenheimer, but he was one of the physicists involved in developing the bomb and thinking through how it might be used.
Very good. So Oppenheimer is basically kind of directing this little city that's built at Los Alamos, New Mexico, and they're going to test the bomb there. And Oppenheimer says, hey, it worked, and it worked so well, beyond anything that we thought. And now we're worried. And we think that maybe that it might be good to let them see. We've got 3 bombs, and maybe you should let them see how destructive this is. And, well, we've already used up one of our bombs. Let's go ahead and show that these will work. So then the message is given to Truman, Churchill, and Stalin that the bomb worked, and they're calling it a baby. The baby's delivered, and it is a healthy boy, and we're expecting his brother any day. And the brother is also a very healthy boy. And on slide 607, then we have America giving a warning to Japan, and they're saying, hey, we've had this healthy boy delivered, so to speak. We've got this bomb. And Lloyd, would you read these for us, please?
Sure. America's warning to Japan. The Japanese were told that the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and China have conferred and agreed that Japan shall be given an opportunity to end the war. The following are our terms. We shall not deviate from them. There are no alternatives. We shall brook no delay. Japanese sovereignty shall be limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and such minor islands as we determine. The Japanese military force, after being completely disarmed, shall be permitted to return to their homes. We do not intend that the Japanese shall be enslaved as a race nor destroyed as a nation. The occupying forces of the Allies shall be withdrawn as soon as there has been established, in accordance with the freely expressed will of the Japanese people, a peacefully inclined and responsible government. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all the Japanese armed forces. The alternative for Japan is complete and utter destruction.
Okay, thank you. So when you read this ultimatum, Scott, tell me a little bit about your thoughts on it.
Well, they haven't said that there's a bomb, and they haven't said that I mean, it's complete and ultimate destruction, but they've been claiming that the whole time.
Okay.
I guess as I think about this whole process, I go back to Chris Hedges, who I cited earlier, and he said there may be important moments when you have to go to war, that you ought to go to war with some kind of humility, realizing that things like this will happen, and so your reasons better be absolutely clear.
It's a perfect way to end today's class period. Thanks so much for being with us, and sorry we had to rush so much at the end. Appreciate you and you students. Bye-bye.